Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 4 from a guy called Gerald, Black Secret Technology. Okay, so we've made it to the project of his that I highlighted in my greatest of all time list addendum. This is the second album that Gerald released on his own Juicebox label, though it would also be the last one before he moved on yet again. This project is yet another pioneering release for the genres of jungle and drum and bass, right at the time when the latter was in its earliest stages. This project, alongside Goldie's Timeless, a little later the same year in 1995, and also Four Heroes Parallel Universe the year previous, I haven't listened to that one in many years, but whatever. Those helped set the scene for the much smoother and jazzier direction the whole genre ended up going in, and is still mostly stuck around in many spots. There have been different movements in this genre since, obviously, but you do definitely still hear drum and bass that sounds kinda like this, even now to this day. Now, where 28 Gun Bad Boy aimed to capture some semblance of gritty reality and evoke the more impoverished areas of Britain that Gerald came up in with its heavy hip-hop influences, Black Secret Technology tried to sound a lot dreamier, more fantastical and futuristic. A lot more R&B and soul and jazz influences going on in here. Like I said, it has a much smoother feel to it. Though the grittier feel of his last album isn't completely abandoned either. You know how I complained about the last album's production being a little subpar? Same deal here. A lot of these mixes still feel kinda flat and tinny and feel like they're really calling for some deeper, more cleanly produced atmosphere. Goldie's Timeless, for instance, is able to deliver that. I do probably prefer that project just by a little bit because the production is better, the songwriting is more memorable. However, it is worth noting that the lower quality production, first of all, is not necessarily a weakness for this album either. It may not feel as polished as it could be, but the very unpolished nature of his last album was something that people told me was part of the appeal for them, that it added to that grit and raw edge that album had. So that could apply here as well. Still got that kind of strange and otherworldly, futuristic vibe, but it's also got a sense of grittiness and dirtiness to it as well. It's got some edge. Another thing that this project has over Timeless is that this is probably the more creative and experimental project. The ideas that went into this one are a little weirder and more out of the box. It definitely covers some territory that Goldie didn't cover himself. And to be fair, Goldie did co-produce one track on this album as well. One of the best cuts, no less, so there is that too. But yeah, may as well just get right into individual tracks. So Many Dreams is a nice solid opener, a thin, airy Pacific State-esque pad progression, fast-paced and somewhat hollow-sounding but still sturdy banging beats, vocal hooks from Wendy Page. You make me feel free. She's gonna come back in the next one. While we're not exactly starting with our absolute best foot forward, it is a nice catchy track that lets you know exactly what you're getting into with this album's sound design. Though the second track, Alita's Dream, that provides a much deeper and more interesting look at these same sounds. You've got quite a few evolving sections that can focus on the banging beats, while other parts focus on the smoother synth pads and blinking melodic textures. There's a few airy vocal samples and muted trumpet licks for that bit of jazziness as well. A track like this is the kind of thing that I come to this album for. Finley's Rainbow is another highlight. It did take me a bit to warm up to the kind of strange, reggae-ish vocal performance from Finley Quay, and the kind of weirdly sparse-sounding production. But once it did, this really did start to stick with me more. The way Quay's voice goes up against all the sparse pads and little synth horns and MIDI-ish pizzicato plucks, and even occasional flute riffs does sound really nice. And you got The Nile, which isn't as memorable as the 3 tracks that precede it, but is still definitely a nice one. Has kind of like a strange honking intro and then abruptly switches over into a different tune entirely that has some odd squonking bass line and cooing vocals that basically just act as synth pads. Also which sound oddly familiar and I can't really put my finger on, but yeah, that's a good one. And then next you got Energy, that's the one that Goldie co-produced. Originally released as a single under the name The 2Gs. Get it? Because Gerald and Goldie. The breakbeats on this one do sound a lot like the ones you'd hear on Timeless, a little Saint Angel-ish maybe, I don't know. Though the stuff on top just blends into the mix with the rest of the album with its calming synth pad progression and repetitive soulful vocal sample. There's sections where the pads have this kind of windy and cold and tonally descending quality to them. Really adds to that atmosphere as well. I think there's even some actual jungle sound effects thrown in there as well, like a really low quality field recording. That's a nice touch. Anyway, then we got Silent Cry. This track was apparently co-produced by someone called Jericho, spelled G-E-R-I-C-O, and subtitled after them on the original 95 version of the album. However, given his credit does not appear in later versions of the album, despite the track barely changing at all in those versions, on top of the fact that the artist's Discogs page says that this is literally the only track in existence with this guy's credit on it, I have a feeling that Jericho is just an alias for Gerald himself and making a pun with his name, because, you know, Gerald, Jericho. Get it? No official confirmation, but I got a pretty strong hunch. Whatever the case, this track is still freaking great, and one of the biggest highlights on the album. Like, all these breaks going up against these synth bells and melancholy pads and moaning vocal snippets makes for one of the most emotive and best sounding tracks in the bunch, and there's whole sections of, like, just the breaks going up against these kinds of whooshing sound effects, like you got this cold draft blowing through the middle of the track. This is some really freaking nice stuff, definitely one of my favorites. Now, this album so far has been fairly straightforward, but the second half shows this album taking a bit more experimental turn with some weirder track ideas. These later half tracks don't stick with me as much as the ones in the first half, but they're still all pretty solid. Well, it's kind of a slow transition into the weirder stuff. Dreaming of You, for instance, has all these strange, bubbling, high-pitched synth pads going up against the pitched-up sample hooks of Take Me Higher, and occasional tribal drum breaks. It's made up of all the same ingredients as most of the tracks before. It just has a slightly different vibe to it, I guess. That's like we're looking at these sounds from a different angle or something. I don't know. And that direction continues on Survival, which has its banging beats, subtle stabbing bass lines, and repetitive samples saying the title, going up against these strange, sort of Native American-ish flute riffs. I don't know. That one's pretty cool. And by the time we get to Cybergen, the transition is complete. Creepy synth melodies and weird, sort of robotic-sounding time-stretched sample going up over these disorienting, honking synth chords, little sped-up, deep-voiced movie dialogue snippets saying the title and other things that I can't make out. Maybe I heard a tiny bit of gospel choir in the background over little laser sound effects, or one-note flutish pads going up over random bleeping synths in other parts. Wasn't sure how I felt about this one on first listen, but it is another one of the biggest growers on here. I wouldn't be into this album as much if it didn't have some of these weirder tracks like these on it. Then you got the Reno, which has like an intro of weird half-laughing, half-talking samples, which was kind of an odd detour. But the actual main bulk of the track does create some cool nocturnal atmosphere with its whirring bass lines and little string section riffs, and sort of Voodoo Rage-esque female vocal snippets that don't sound like they're in the same key. Also has a fake fade-out at one point, for the heck of it, I guess. Meanwhile, the track Cyber Jazz I wanted to mark as a highlight just because of its title, though it is a little disappointingly dull and doesn't really live up to that title. It doesn't really have any jazz elements, and this cyber part of it might be a bit of an overstatement as well. Still not a bad track at all, like the pizzicato plucks going up against lots of different disconnected samples and synth pads do make for a fairly interesting mix if I do sit up and pay attention to it. Maybe it's called Cyber Jazz because Gerald improvised it or something. I don't actually know, though it does kind of have like that sort of freeform lack of structure to it as if it were improvised, I guess. Then you got Voodoo Rage, which, if you guessed that this was a drum and bass rework of Gerald's signature hit, yeah, duh. I would not say that this track rages. I think it's just titled as such because Gerald now has like a better sampler at this point that was able to fit the entire Voodoo Rage snippet rather than just cutting off the G sound like the original did. I would not say that this track is an improvement on the original cut either, and this would now be the third album out of 4 so far that had some version of this track on it. Maybe starting to get a tad sick of hearing new versions of this track, but, you know, it's still fine for what it is, and it still fits into the mix of the rest of the album pretty well. And thankfully, just as I start to get the feeling that this album is, like, deflating and losing me, we close with Life Unfolds His Mystery, which is a refreshingly solid way to go out that sort of mirrors so many dreams. a simple piece that doesn't have much to it beyond its vocal snippets, which may or may not be provided by Gerald himself again, and its typical mix of synth pads and skittering breaks, a very laid-back and relaxing finish, and that part halfway through where the amen breaks come in and seem to double in weight and impact, that was pretty great too. So yeah, that's Black Secret Technology. It's also worth noting that there are a few alternate versions of this album that have some different exclusive tracks, like there's a 96 re-release that tacks on the tracks Heckle and Koch and Touch Me on the beginning and end respectively. They're cool, but probably wouldn't stick out to me that much in the bigger scheme of the track listing. And also that version removes the track Voodoo Rage, supposedly because Gerald was suspecting the track might be cursed based on the album's original poor commercial performance and how much money record companies made on the original Voodoo Ray, while Gerald still had to work at McDonald's. There's also supposedly an earlier CD version that adds like a hidden 14th track at the end, which I have not heard. On the iTunes version, there's a bonus track called End of the Tunnel, which sounds like this kind of R&B type thing, a la I Won't Give In on Automatic, but darker. That might be the hidden track in question, but I can't confirm for myself. Still, all that aside, Black Secret Technology is a pretty great album. It is not infinitely replayable by any stretch. I heard it like 5-6 times while preparing for this review, and the flat production did occasionally grate on me a bit, and would end up putting me in a worse mood even in spite of how uplifting these tracks were trying to be. But any personal gripes I might have with this project, I think, are just made up for by how much respect I have for it. Those little personal things, they don't get in the way too much. Because all this aside, this is a drum and bass classic. This is a project that really helped pioneer so many formulas and sounds in this genre that can still be presently felt to this day. And I also think it hits that perfect balance of experimentalism and accessibility to really be up my usual alley and still hold up even after all these years of the genre having been built on and changing. I don't really know what else to say. Not sure if it's Gerald's best overall, but it is one of his best overall for sure. And I think I can pretty easily mark this project as essential listening, whether you're looking for historical game changers or just a solid little drum and bass project that still resonates 25 years later. And I think I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.